Lakewood, Georgia. A town that prided itself on its small-town charm and its faith in God, where the streets were lined with modest homes and the towering Faithful Life Baptist Church sat like a pillar in the center of the community. The church was more than just a place of worship, it was the heartbeat of the town, where every Sunday morning the pews were filled with families seeking guidance, redemption, and a sense of belonging. And at the helm of this sacred institution stood Reverend Samuel Carter, a man who had led the congregation for over 2 decades, admired for his wisdom, integrity, and unwavering faith. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect family and community, darkness had begun to fester. Ellen Carter, Samuel's wife of 20 years, had always been the quiet strength behind her husband's success. With her graceful demeanor and supportive nature, she had been the model pastor's wife. But as the years went by, something began to change within her. The long hours Samuel spent immersed in his ministry, preparing sermons, counseling parishioners, and leading events, left little room for their marriage. Ellen had once been the center of Samuel's world, but now, she felt like a shadow in the background, fading into the recesses of his busy life. Her loneliness began to grow like a silent cancer, eating away at her from the inside. As the seasons changed, so did Ellen. Her once vibrant smile began to fade, and a weariness settled behind her eyes, one that no amount of prayer or devotion could ease. She had been the perfect pastor's wife, the pillar of strength in their home. But with each passing day, she felt less seen, less valued, and more invisible to the man she loved. In June of 2021, the shift became undeniable. Samuel, once a partner in their marriage, was now a distant figure, his heart tethered more to the church than to her. The distance between them grew, and Ellen found herself adrift in a sea of isolation, her only anchor the duties she performed for Samuel and the church. But as she spent more time alone in their home, she began to feel the void deepen. The prayers, once so powerful and reassuring, seemed to fall flat against the wall of her desperation. That's when Jamal Thompson entered her life. Jamal, the 19-year-old son of Pastor Williams from a neighboring church, was everything Samuel was no longer: young, confident, and full of life. He exuded a kind of energy that Ellen hadn't felt in years. Tall and athletic with a dazzling smile, Jamal was magnetic, drawing the attention of everyone around him, especially Ellen. But it wasn't just his looks. It was his presence. His confidence. The way he spoke, as though the world was his to conquer. He reminded her of the man Samuel had been when they first met, full of ambition, warmth, and life. Jamal had been dating Ellen's daughter, Chloe, for a few months. Chloe, headstrong and deeply involved in the church like her parents, was eager to talk about her plans for the future with Jamal. But for Ellen, the attraction was different. Whenever Jamal was around, she couldn't help but notice the way he looked at her. The way he seemed to linger a little longer in conversations, as if drawn to her in a way that she hadn't felt in years. At first, it was subtle, a lingering glance during church events, a fleeting moment when their eyes met across the room. But with each passing encounter, the tension between them grew, undeniable and electric. It was something unspoken but there, lingering in the air between them, pulling them closer without either of them fully understanding why. By the summer of 2021, the line between innocent interaction and something more had blurred. Ellen found herself seeking out Jamal's attention, her once proud marriage reduced to an empty shell. She began finding excuses to be around whenever Jamal came over to visit Chloe, and when he wasn't there, she would catch herself longing for his presence. Their conversations were innocuous enough, talk of church functions, community events, family life, but beneath the surface of these casual exchanges, something deeper was taking root. Something forbidden. Something that both thrilled and terrified her. Ellen knew the consequences of what she was doing. She knew it was wrong. She knew that if anyone found out about the attraction between her and Jamal, it would destroy her family, her faith, and the image she had so carefully cultivated. But the loneliness, the emptiness that had swallowed her whole, made it easy to justify her actions. At least in Jamal's presence, she didn't feel invisible anymore. She felt seen. She felt alive. But the more she sought him out, the more entangled she became. The emotional pull of Jamal was impossible to resist. The void in her heart grew smaller each time they spoke, each time they shared a smile, a laugh. But even as her heart raced with excitement, a whisper of guilt began to claw at her soul. She was betraying Samuel. She was betraying her vows. She was betraying God. But it felt too late to turn back. And little did she know, Samuel had begun to notice. As the summer of 2021 wore on, Ellen's secret interactions with Jamal deepened, though she tried to convince herself that they were innocent. She told herself it was harmless, just conversations, just brief moments of attention that filled the void in her life. But in the quietest parts of her mind, she knew the truth. The connection between them was more than just a passing flirtation. It was something darker, something that both excited and terrified her. Jamal, for his part, was aware of the growing attraction. He had always respected Reverend Samuel Carter. After all, Samuel had been his spiritual guide and a mentor in many ways. Jamal had known Chloe for months now, and the relationship between them had always seemed promising, though Chloe had yet to realize the full extent of the emotional distance that had opened up between her parents. But the pull between him and Ellen was undeniable. At first, it had been harmless, small gestures, lingering eye contact, moments when their words seemed to hang in the air longer than necessary. Jamal, young and full of life, was drawn to Ellen's quiet strength, to the way she held herself with grace despite the obvious distance in her marriage. He was fascinated by her intelligence, the way she seemed so composed, yet there was something about her that spoke of a deeper longing, a yearning for something more than the life she had settled into. Something in her eyes told him she wasn't as content as she let on. One afternoon, when Chloe was away visiting a friend in a neighboring town, Jamal came over to the Carter house under the guise of helping with some church preparations. Ellen was in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal for herself when Jamal knocked on the door. She had been expecting him to come by. He'd become a regular presence in the house, though the visits were becoming less about church business and more about something else. Something unspoken. "Mrs. Carter, I hope I'm not interrupting," Jamal said with that easy smile, his voice full of warmth. "No, not at all. Just making dinner. Would you like to join me?" Ellen asked, her voice slightly trembling despite herself. There was a tension in the air, something that neither of them could ignore. Jamal smiled, stepping into the kitchen, his presence filling the room. "I'd love to, but I should get back to the church after this." Ellen nodded, but her heart skipped a beat as she watched him move around the room. He seemed so comfortable in her space, so at ease, as if he belonged there. She felt something stir inside her, something she hadn't felt in years. The spark of something dangerous and forbidden. As they sat down together to eat, their conversation drifted from church matters to more personal topics. Jamal spoke about his dreams, his aspirations, and the challenges he faced as the son of a pastor. He confided in Ellen about his growing disillusionment with his own family's expectations, and Ellen listened intently, offering her perspective. She had always been the supportive wife, the one who listened without judgment, but now, for the first time in a long while, she felt as though someone was listening to her too. "I sometimes wonder if my whole life has been mapped out for me," Jamal confessed, his voice low and thoughtful. "I've never really had a chance to make my own choices." Ellen's gaze softened, her own sense of entrapment mirrored in his words. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "we live our lives for others. And we forget what we need for ourselves." Jamal's eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment, Ellen felt the weight of the unspoken words hanging between them. It was as if the universe itself was pushing them toward this moment, toward something they both knew they shouldn't feel, but did anyway. After dinner, they sat in the living room, the evening stretching on in silence. Ellen felt a strange mix of fear and anticipation. She knew what was happening. She could feel it in the way Jamal looked at her, in the way their conversations had shifted from friendly to intimate. It wasn't just about church anymore, it was about them. "Mrs. Carter." "Ellen," Jamal said, his voice soft, as though testing the waters. "I know things aren't easy at home. I can see it. I don't want to make things harder, but I think you deserve to feel something different." Her breath caught in her throat. Ellen had tried so hard to bury her feelings, to deny the growing attraction she felt toward him. But here he was, acknowledging it. And somehow, that made it real. The boundaries she had placed around herself began to erode, and the desire for something more, a connection, an escape from the emptiness, became impossible to ignore. "I don't know what you mean," Ellen replied, her voice barely above a whisper, but her eyes betrayed her. She couldn't hide the truth anymore. Jamal's hand brushed against hers, sending a shiver down her spine. "I think you do," he said softly. "I think we both do." The moment was charged, the air thick with tension. Ellen's heart raced, her mind screaming at her to pull away, to stop this before it went any further. But her body, her emotions, were already beyond her control. In that instant, something shifted between them. It was no longer just a fleeting attraction. It was real. It was dangerous. And it was a secret neither of them could escape. That night, Ellen lay awake in bed, her thoughts spinning wildly. Jamal's words echoed in her mind, and the warmth of his touch lingered on her skin. She knew this was wrong. She knew she was betraying Samuel, betraying everything she had once believed in. But the loneliness, the isolation that had consumed her for so long, had now been replaced by something far more dangerous, desire. And it was a craving she didn't know if she could control. Jamal had become a temptation she couldn't resist. And as the days passed, the line between right and wrong, love and betrayal, blurred more and more. As the months slipped by, Ellen's secret meetings with Jamal grew more frequent, and the danger of their affair became increasingly apparent. What had begun as stolen glances and lingering conversations had now turned into a dangerous game, one neither of them seemed able, or willing, to stop. Their interactions, once innocent, were now charged with a raw, magnetic energy that neither could deny. Ellen found herself thinking about Jamal constantly. She replayed their conversations in her mind, the way his touch had lingered, the way he had looked at her as though she was the only woman in the room. But as the affair deepened, so did the guilt that gnawed at her. Ellen couldn't ignore the weight of what she was doing to her family, her marriage, and her faith. Every time she saw Samuel, every time she kissed him goodnight, she felt the betrayal rise within her like a tidal wave. She knew she was hurting him. She could see the distance in his eyes when they spoke, the way he seemed lost in his own world, absorbed by the demands of the church. But that didn't excuse what she was doing. She was lying to him, deceiving him, and no amount of justification could erase the wrongness of it. At the same time, the relationship with Jamal, despite its intoxicating rush, was beginning to feel like a trap. The passion, the desire that she had sought for so long, was now coupled with fear. Ellen couldn't shake the image of what would happen if anyone found out, if Samuel discovered the truth. If the town found out, if Chloe found out. She had been living in a bubble of secrecy, and with every stolen moment, it felt as though the walls were closing in around her. But the worst part was how it affected the rest of her family. Chloe, their bright, ambitious daughter, had started to notice the subtle changes in her mother's behavior. Ellen had always been a rock for Chloe, someone she could turn to for guidance. But lately, her mother had become distant, unreachable, even when they were in the same room. Chloe found herself wondering what had happened to the woman who had always been there for her. Ellen was still the same loving mother on the surface, but something was different. She was distracted, tired, as though a weight was pressing on her that she couldn't shake off. One evening, in late October 2021, Samuel returned home late from a church event. It was a cold night, and the air was thick with the promise of a storm. The wind rattled the windows, and the silence in the house felt oppressive. Ellen was sitting at the kitchen table, pretending to read, but her thoughts were miles away. The house had been quiet for hours. Chloe was upstairs, and Samuel had been gone for most of the day. The peace was unsettling, as though everything had been paused in time, waiting for the inevitable. Samuel entered the kitchen, his coat still on, his face drawn with exhaustion. He set his keys down on the counter with a soft clink, his eyes meeting Ellen's for the first time that day. He looked tired, but there was something else in his gaze, a weariness that had nothing to do with his work. "Ellen," Samuel began, his voice quiet but firm. "We need to talk." Ellen's stomach twisted. She knew what was coming. She had been dreading this moment for weeks, but she couldn't escape it any longer. The distance between them had grown too wide for either of them to ignore. She had hoped that by avoiding the conversation, by pretending things were fine, she could buy herself more time. But that was no longer possible. "I know things haven't been easy lately," Samuel continued, his voice tinged with a sadness Ellen hadn't heard in years. "I've been so caught up in everything at the church. I've neglected you. I see that now. And I'm sorry." Ellen's heart ached as she watched him, this man she had loved for so long, who had once been her partner in everything. She felt the sharp sting of guilt, but there was something else, too. Something buried deep inside her, resentment, anger, frustration. She had been left behind, left to carry the weight of their marriage while Samuel gave his all to the church. For years, she had prayed for things to change, but he hadn't noticed. And now she had found something that made her feel alive again. But she couldn't tell him that. She couldn't admit to the truth that had been festering inside her. "I don't know what to say, Samuel," Ellen replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I feel so lost. So alone." Samuel stepped closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch her shoulder. "I've been so focused on the church, on the work that needs to be done. I've neglected the one person who needs me the most." His words were filled with regret, and Ellen could see the sincerity in his eyes, but it didn't reach her. Not anymore. The air between them was thick with unspoken truths, with the weight of everything left unsaid. Ellen opened her mouth to speak, but before she could find the words, there was a knock at the door. Chloe entered the kitchen, her face pale and her eyes wide. "Mom, Dad. I saw something strange." Ellen's heart skipped a beat. The fear that had been building inside her all this time now felt like a physical presence, standing at the edge of the room, ready to consume them all. "What is it, Chloe?" Samuel asked, his voice tense. "I saw Jamal," Chloe said, her voice shaking. "He was standing outside the house, watching us. I didn't know what to do. He was just standing there, staring at the window." Ellen froze. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, the world around her seemed to spin. The walls she had so carefully built around her secret were crumbling. Her daughter had seen Jamal. Her daughter had seen them. The secret was out. Everything was about to unravel. In that moment, Ellen knew there was no turning back. The affair, the lies, the deception, everything she had worked so hard to keep hidden was now exposed. And she had no idea what would come next. Samuel's face darkened as he turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "Ellen, what's going on?" he asked, his voice colder than she had ever heard it. The calm facade had cracked. The explosion was about to begin. And Ellen, trapped between her guilt and her desire, realized that this was only the beginning. The storm that had been gathering for months was about to break, and there was no escaping its fury. The air in Lakewood had grown thick with suspicion and fear. The small town, known for its tight-knit community and quiet streets, was now the epicenter of a tragedy that no one could have anticipated. Jamal Thompson's death had shaken the very foundation of the town, and the Carter family was at the heart of it. The whispers began almost immediately. The questions followed. And the truth, like an avalanche, started to bury everything in its path. Ellen sat in the dimly lit interrogation room of the Lakewood Police Department, her hands trembling on her lap as she stared at the metal table in front of her. The sound of the clock ticking on the wall was the only thing breaking the silence. Detective Aaron Miller had asked her to come down to the station earlier that morning, and now, hours had passed without her speaking much. The weight of Jamal's death hung over her like a dark cloud. She had never imagined her life would come to this, a series of choices leading to a tragedy that she could no longer hide from. Her mind raced with thoughts of the night before, when she and Samuel had finally confronted the truth, when the lies began to unravel. But even then, she hadn't known how deep it would go, how everything she had tried to protect, the family, the reputation, the image of their perfect life, would now be torn apart. Detective Miller, a seasoned investigator in his mid-40s with graying hair and sharp, observant eyes, sat across from her. He had been quiet for some time, watching her, as if waiting for her to break. He knew how these things worked. He had seen it all before, guilt manifesting in the eyes, the way people struggled to hide the truth even when it was right in front of them. But there was something about Ellen Carter that didn't sit right with him. The way she looked at him, as though she were waiting for something to happen, but couldn't quite make sense of it. "Mrs. Carter," Detective Miller began, his voice calm but firm. "I understand this is difficult. But we need to talk about the night Jamal was killed. We need to know everything." Ellen's chest tightened as she looked up at him. "I don't know what you want me to say," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I don't know who did this to him. I didn't." "Mrs. Carter," the detective interrupted, his tone softening slightly but still intense, "I'm not accusing you. But we both know there's more to this than just a random act of violence. Jamal was found in that house, just outside town. And the last people who saw him were you and your husband." Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to know so much. The thought of Samuel being dragged into this, of their private lives being dissected in such a public way, made her stomach turn. But it was too late to hide from the truth now. Jamal, he was a part of our lives. A friend. "A mistake," Ellen said, the words feeling like shards of glass as they left her mouth. "But I didn't want this. I didn't want him to die." Detective Miller leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Mrs. Carter, I need you to think very carefully. What happened the night Jamal was killed? We know that he was supposed to meet you at the house. We know you were both there. But what we don't know is why he's dead. Was there someone else? Was Samuel involved?" The mention of Samuel's name made Ellen flinch. Her heart ached, the weight of guilt heavier than ever before. Samuel had no idea how close to the edge they had come, how their entire world was about to be destroyed. But now, there was no going back. The investigation had begun, and every word she spoke would either pull her family deeper into the abyss or give them a chance at survival. "Samuel, he didn't kill Jamal," Ellen said firmly, though there was doubt in her own voice. She wanted to believe it, needed to believe it. "He didn't know. He just found out about the affair the night before." And then what?" Detective Miller pressed. Ellen's mind flashed back to the night before. Samuel's face, pale with shock and betrayal, staring at her as she admitted the truth. Chloe's frightened face as she had walked in on them, forcing her mother to finally reveal the affair. The raw, painful honesty of that moment had shattered them all. But even then, she hadn't seen how deep the anger ran in Samuel's heart. She hadn't imagined that their marriage, once a symbol of devotion and faith, could be crushed so quickly. "I don't know," Ellen whispered. "We fought. But, no. Samuel wouldn't have hurt Jamal." Detective Miller studied her for a moment before sitting back in his chair. "Mrs. Carter, I know this is hard. But it's important we piece this together. We need to know what happened. Your daughter told us she saw Jamal standing outside your house the night before he died. Do you have any idea why? Ellen's breath caught in her throat. Chloe. She had been so preoccupied with the chaos of the affair, the lies she had told Samuel, that she hadn't even considered what Chloe might have seen. Her daughter had been the one to uncover everything, to witness the beginning of their downfall. I don't know why Jamal was outside, Ellen said, shaking her head. But I do know that after the fight, after everything came out, I never saw him again. He left, and I thought that was the end of it. The detective nodded slowly, scribbling something on his notepad. We have more to go on, Mrs. Carter. You're not the only one involved in this. Jamal was loved by many, and someone out there might have had their own reasons for what happened. You just need to keep thinking, keep telling us everything. As the conversation stretched on, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but the answers were elusive. The murder of Jamal Thompson had become more than just a crime, it was a deep reflection of the dark undercurrents in Ellen's life, her marriage, and the community around her. Each revelation opened more doors, each question pulling her further into a web she couldn't escape. Samuel's silence was deafening. The thought of what he might have done, or what might have pushed him to the breaking point, sent shivers down her spine. The affair, the lies, the secrets, all of it had led to Jamal's death. And Ellen knew that as the investigation unfolded, everything she had fought to protect would be ripped apart, piece by piece. What started as a betrayal between lovers was now an unraveling of everything she held dear. The truth was no longer just about Jamal's death, it was about facing the consequences of her actions. And the weight of those consequences was more than she could bear. The days that followed Jamal's death were a blur of questioning, remorse, and uncertainty. Lakewood, once a peaceful, almost idyllic town, had transformed into a place where suspicion and grief hung heavy in the air. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that there was more to this tragedy than a simple case of murder. The town was left to pick up the pieces of its shattered image, as were the Carter family. But the hardest part, something that no one could prepare for, was the realization that the real crime wasn't just the murder of Jamal Thompson. It was the betrayal, the broken trust, and the consequences of choices made in desperation. Ellen sat in the small living room of her home, her face drawn with exhaustion. The police had cleared out for the night, but their questions still echoed in her mind. Samuel had been quiet since their last confrontation, and Chloe, still processing the horror of what had unfolded, hadn't said a word about the events that night. The house felt suffocating, like a tomb for the family's hopes and dreams. And Ellen couldn't help but wonder if anything could ever be the same again. She had spent her entire life trying to be the perfect pastor's wife, the dutiful mother, the devoted partner. But beneath that carefully crafted image had been a woman drowning in loneliness, a woman who had neglected the very essence of what it meant to be loved, cherished, and truly known. Her affair with Jamal had been a way to fill that void. It had been an escape, an illusion of affection that, in the end, had cost her everything. But the weight of Jamal's death was more than Ellen could bear. As the reality of what had happened began to sink in, she realized that her actions had not only destroyed her marriage but had also hurt those who had loved her most. Samuel, the man who had stood by her for 2 decades, was now a stranger. Chloe, who had looked up to her mother with admiration, had witnessed the destruction of her family's foundation. Ellen had built her world on lies, and now, she was left standing in the ruins. The message of her story was undeniable: choices have consequences. Each decision, each moment of weakness, each moment of deception had led to a tragedy far greater than she could have imagined. Ellen's infidelity, driven by her own emotional neglect, had unleashed a chain of events that had spiraled out of control. In a desperate attempt to feel alive again, she had unknowingly placed her family in the path of a storm that no one could stop. But the lesson was not just for Ellen, it was for all of them. It was a lesson in vulnerability, in the power of connection, and the dangers of letting unmet needs fester until they tore apart everything around you. Ellen's affair with Jamal had been about more than lust, it had been about emotional fulfillment, the need to feel seen and valued. She had been so focused on filling that void that she hadn't realized how far she had strayed from the person she used to be. She hadn't understood that the very thing she sought, connection, affection, recognition, was the thing she had neglected in her marriage. In her effort to find something outside herself, she had fractured the foundation of her family and lost the love and respect of the people who had once adored her. Samuel, too, was not without fault. His absorption in his ministry had created a chasm between him and Ellen, one that had left her emotionally adrift. He had built his life around the church, around helping others, but in doing so, he had forgotten the most important person in his life, his wife. His failure to see her struggles, to be present for her, had driven her to seek out something else. And though Samuel had not been responsible for Jamal's death, his own failure to truly connect with Ellen had played a part in the unraveling of their marriage. In the end, the lesson was about the fragility of relationships and the need for constant communication, empathy, and understanding. It was about the need to tend to the emotional needs of those we love before it's too late. Ellen had taken her marriage for granted, and now she was paying the price. Samuel had taken his wife for granted, and now his entire life had come crashing down. Ellen's guilt was overwhelming. She couldn't undo the pain she had caused, the damage she had inflicted on her family. But there was one thing she could still do: face the consequences of her actions. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, filled with regret and heartache, but it was the only path left. She would have to rebuild her life from the ground up, and that meant facing the truth, about herself, about her choices, and about the people she had hurt. Samuel, too, would need to face the truth. He had built his identity on being a moral leader, a man of faith, but the reality of his failure to protect his own family would haunt him for the rest of his life. Whether they could rebuild their marriage, or whether their relationship would be irreparably damaged, remained to be seen. But the journey of healing would not be easy for either of them. And then there was Chloe. She was the silent victim in this tragedy, the one who had seen too much too soon, the one who had been forced to confront the imperfections of her parents and the fragility of their love. Her world had been shattered, and she would have to find her own way through the wreckage. She had witnessed the pain of betrayal, the depth of human failure, and the overwhelming consequences of dishonesty. But perhaps, in time, Chloe would learn the most important lesson of all, that love, trust, and forgiveness are not just words, but actions we must choose every day. The Carter family's story was not just one of betrayal and loss, it was a story of redemption. It was a story about the power of facing the truth, no matter how painful, and about the strength it takes to rebuild what has been broken. For Ellen, the journey would be long and filled with sorrow, but perhaps, in the end, it would also lead to something new, a chance to begin again, to heal, and to seek the kind of connection she had longed for all along. The message was clear: only when we are honest with ourselves and those we love can we begin to truly heal. As the weeks passed, the Carter family became a symbol of what happens when the lies we tell ourselves and others finally catch up to us. Ellen, Samuel, and Chloe each faced the painful task of rebuilding their lives from the ashes of their broken world. The weight of their individual guilt hung over them, but so did the possibility of redemption, if they were willing to face it. Ellen had spent years hiding behind the facade of a perfect life, but the affair with Jamal had exposed her vulnerabilities, her deepest desires, and her failures. Now, as she sat alone in their empty living room one evening, the weight of what she had done seemed almost unbearable. She had betrayed the one person who had trusted her, and in doing so, she had shattered their marriage and the family they had built. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. The truth had been revealed, and the road to healing was long and uncertain. Samuel, too, was struggling. The shock of Ellen's betrayal had torn through him like a storm, and in its wake, he had to confront not only the collapse of his marriage but also the realization that his work, his faith, and his devotion to the church had come at the expense of the most important relationship in his life. How had he not seen the cracks in their marriage? How had he not noticed the loneliness in Ellen's eyes? His pride, his commitment to his ministry, had left him blind to the needs of the woman who had stood beside him all these years. But despite the pain, there was something in Samuel that still yearned for reconciliation. He loved Ellen, despite everything that had happened. He knew that rebuilding their marriage would take more than just words, it would take time, effort, and the willingness to forgive, even when it seemed impossible. He didn't know if they could find their way back to each other, but he also knew that without trying, there would be nothing left. Samuel was no stranger to faith, but now, he had to find faith not just in God, but in himself and in the possibility of forgiveness. Chloe, caught in the crossfire of her parents' betrayal, was perhaps the most affected. The image she had held of her parents, of their perfect love, their unwavering commitment to one another, had been shattered in an instant. She had witnessed the unraveling of her family, and the pain of that revelation ran deep. But Chloe was also learning something about herself, something that no one could have prepared her for. She was learning that even in the darkest moments, there was the possibility of growth, of strength, and of finding her own way forward. She had seen her mother's mistakes, but she had also seen her courage in admitting them. She had seen her father's heartbreak, but she had also seen his willingness to try to fix what was broken. For Chloe, the future was uncertain, but it was also filled with the possibility of healing. The journey would be long, and there were no guarantees, but she could no longer cling to the image of perfection that had once defined her family. Instead, she was learning to embrace the messy, imperfect truth of what it meant to be human. She was learning that mistakes didn't have to define a person, that they could be the catalyst for change and growth. In the end, the Carter family had a choice, to either let the weight of their mistakes crush them, or to use those mistakes as the foundation for a new beginning. The road to forgiveness would not be easy. Trust would need to be rebuilt, and old wounds would need to be healed. But perhaps, just perhaps, the very act of facing the truth, of acknowledging their failures, could give them the strength to rebuild not just their marriage, but their lives. Ellen, Samuel, and Chloe each stood at a crossroads, each one unsure of what the future held but willing to take the first step toward healing. They had lost so much, but they had also gained something invaluable, the chance to rebuild, to grow, and to find the kind of love that was grounded not in perfection, but in truth. As the story of the Carter family comes to a close, we're left with lingering questions about love, trust, and forgiveness. Can a marriage survive the deepest betrayal? Can a family heal from the wounds caused by lies and secrets? Is it possible to rebuild after everything has been torn apart? These questions are not just for Ellen and Samuel, they're questions that we all must ask ourselves. What do you think about this story? Do you believe that the Carter family can find their way back to each other, or is their relationship beyond repair? Have you ever experienced a situation where trust was broken and had to be rebuilt? Leave your thoughts and comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective and engage in a meaningful conversation about the power of forgiveness, love, and the lessons we learn from our mistakes. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that delve into the complexities of human relationships.